Two recent deaths in holding cells at a Boston police station have put a spotlight on concerns over the safety of people in detention, as well as policies connected with incarceration and health needs. The issues have long been a concern of Prisoners Legal Services. We'd like to welcome its Executive Director, Elizabeth Matos. Thank you very much for being with us, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to start with these cases of detention. They're still under investigation. We don't know everything about what happened. But what are your concerns, especially if there's somebody who's detained, who has substance use disorder?
Yeah, our general feelings are that if someone needs substance use treatment, they should be getting that in the community. If you're serving a sentence, you absolutely have to be incarcerated, then it makes sense to treat the person while they're there, otherwise it's a missed opportunity. But if you don't really need to be there, you should be getting community-based treatment. Jails are definitely not the ideal place to treat people who have a disease and who need medical treatment, and that should be happening in the community.
Well, sometimes people do end up being detained at least for a few days in
Right.
connection with some kind of criminal or misdemeanor activity. But what about the kind of supervision they need to have just to avoid dying during that time?
Right, so this is a problem we're seeing more and more with the opioid crisis and with just substance use disorder in general. People are getting arrested for a short period of time, and what we're seeing is that, like in the case, this recent case, that the lockup facilities are not equipped to really handle this, and they're actually seeing arguably a considerable number of these people because they hold them for short periods of time and then send them off to the jails. And they don't have mental health staff, and they don't have clinicians who are able to really assess what the state of mind is of the person and what they're going through in terms of detox, which is a very serious medical condition and often life-threatening, as we've seen. So I think it's problematic that they don't have the staff available to really assess what's going on. And if we're serious about being able to identify this, prevent deaths, and get people the treatment they need, we really need to have access to those folks, even for the holding facilities.
I'm a layperson, so sometimes I can easily imagine somebody being detained who looks drowsy. They fall asleep, apparently. What's the difference between my perception and what a clinician might see there?
Well, it's generally when someone comes in, there should be a vitals check of some sort, so that you would have some other indicia of the person going through a detox, and not just the naked eye and looking at someone. But for sure, I think there are other things. If someone's detoxing, and they're passed out versus sleeping, a clinician would be able to recognize the difference.
Of course, you're also concerned about what happens when people are incarcerated. They have substance use disorder. Before they're incarcerated, they might have been taking some kind of medication to supplant an opioid. What about their access to that same kind of continuum of treatment?
Yeah, so that's a problem. So there are a couple of answers to the question of whether or not jails should provide drug treatment. Unfortunately, one is yes and one is no, right? On the yes side, again, if someone needs to be there and they were on medication before going in, the jails have an obligation under law, would be what we would argue and what other cases are finding as well, to continue that medication-assisted treatment to treat whether it's an opioid addiction or access to treatment for another kind of addiction. There should be a continuation, a continuity of care, if you will, while the person is being held. However, again, if we have a situation in Massachusetts where we're the only state in the nation that incarcerates people who have not been charged with a crime just to receive drug treatment. And there's a lawsuit pending on that. There's also legislation pending. But that's a circumstance where people don't need to be in a jail or a prison.
And those are civil commitments, if I'm not mistaken, right?
They're what?
Are those civil commitments you're talking about?
Those are civil commitments, yeah. But they're being placed in a jail or prison. They're being incarcerated for treatment. So that's a situation that we absolutely should not have. We should be providing that treatment in the community. Those are our tax dollars going to pay for a very expensive, it's certainly, we're talking about up to over $40,000 a head per year to incarcerate someone, and that is not including what the additional cost of the medication-assisted treatment would be. Those services could be much better provided and are more evidence-based in community-based settings that are therapeutic. Jails, by nature, are counter-therapeutic environments and you have someone going in with resistance to recovery, stigma, all of those things are barriers to long-term recovery. And we're just going to spend more and more money churning people into the system and out of the system and into the system and out. It's a very ineffective way to deal with what is a massive problem that we're dealing with, not just here in Massachusetts, but across the country. If we want to be serious about dealing with this problem, not see the same people on methadone mile or the same people in our communities struggling with addiction issues, then we need to have a much more evidence-based approach that's going to get us effective results.
I want to come back to the no part of the answer on access to medications for substance use disorder, because officials in the corrections system have been saying if you allow those in, that also creates a problem when they're not used appropriately or if they're redistributed in some way. What do you say to that?
So there's been a lot of studies on this issue, and treatment centers deal with the same problem. So you just have to observe people. There are particular ways you can administer the medication so that it's not being abused. But more importantly, studies have shown that if you provide treatment in prisons, you won't have as much of a contraband issue. So I don't know if you know this, but many people maybe don't know that drugs are unfortunately very readily available in our prisons and jails. And partially it's because there's a high demand. There's a lot of idleness in prison, a lot of people with substance use issues going in and not having access to treatment. And so there's a high demand, and there's this black market that has existed for as long as I think anyone can remember. And studies have shown that in facilities where they've actually employed medication-assisted treatment and real access to substance use treatment, you see a much lower demand for contraband and much less of an issue with contraband in prisons. And the issue of contraband in prisons is has lots of problems, including gang issues inside the prison, people competing for the market in the prison. It's very messy and incredibly dangerous. And so it would be in everyone's best interest to invest in something that's already been shown to decrease demand for contraband in prisons.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Elizabeth Matos from Prisoners Legal Services. Elizabeth, I also want to ask you about another issue you've been working on for quite a while, and that's solitary confinement. What would you say is different about the way we do this in Massachusetts as compared with other states?
Well, I'd say right now, there's a bit of a resistance in the state to implementing legislation that was passed last year in Massachusetts. So last year, Massachusetts passed the Criminal Justice Reform Act, which was quite significant and probably the most significant criminal justice reform we've seen in decades in our state. And one of the major pieces of that legislation was to reform solitary confinement and how that's used not just in the Department of Correction, but in county facilities across the state as well. And what we've seen just in the rollout of regulations by the department in response to that, and to that legislation, is definitely an effort to restrict what the spirit of that law was really trying to do. And legislators themselves, who were architects of the legislation, have come out pushing back, I think, quite forcefully against the DOC, and saying that this is not a true interpretation of what the statute was intended to do. And so there's definitely a back and forth happening right now where we're seeing a cultural resistance to changing solitary confinement. In many other states across the country, change has really happened actually from the top down, with administrators who have studied the issue, who have really embraced evidence-based practices and seen that solitary confinement, long-term placement in solitary confinement in particular, and placement of people with serious mental illness in solitary confinement does not work, and in fact has disastrous effects not only on those individuals, but on society and on the prison environment. And so they have drastically reduced their numbers in solitary confinement and have found no correlation with an uptick in violence, and in fact the contrary in many states, including Maine, Colorado, North Dakota, states all over the country, really. And I think what we're seeing here is a significant resistance, not by all, but by certainly most of the administrators right now. A couple of facilities, I think, are embracing the law a little more, like Middlesex County and Hampden County are really have been implementing changes to solitary confinement for quite some time. But the Department of Correction and a number of other correctional facilities are having to really force change within their institutions.
At least in movies, solitary confinement is usually presented as a way to quarantine prisoners, maybe protect them from getting harmed by other prisoners. Isn't that still necessary to some degree?
So for the most part, what we see are minor rule infractions that land people in solitary confinement. There are certainly people who have outbursts and inflict violence on other people in the system. And I don't think anyone would say that there isn't a need to maybe temporarily remove that person from general population to deal with the problem. But in the end, you really shouldn't have anyone there long term. There should be an effort to figure out what went wrong and what that person actually needs. Is it a mental health issue? Is it just they need some other kind of programming? But generally, keeping someone there long term only exacerbates violence because of what it does to you physically.
What do you know about the length of terms in solitary for people in the state? Any numbers?
So that was the other thing. In Massachusetts, we're outliers nationally in that we have one of the most restrictive solitary confinement units in the country, where people can be sentenced for up to 10 years per disciplinary infraction to solitary confinement. So we certainly have people in Massachusetts who have been serving 2 decades in solitary confinement in a unit that's called the DDU, Department Disciplinary Unit. And just to go back to the point of what it inflicts on the body, so solitary confinement, long-term solitary confinement actually changes the chemical makeup of your brain because of the absence of stimulus. It really affects you socially in a way that oftentimes is irreversible. And I think because of the incontrovertible evidence of that over time and the science that has really shown what the impact of solitary confinement can do, particularly on people with existing mental health issues, people are really curtailing that and looking for alternatives. And many alternatives exist to using solitary confinement. So someone could have any number of rule infractions, and instead of solitary confinement, you can take away access to visits, you can take away access to canteen. There are a lot of disciplinary things you can do that don't inflict further harm on the individual and as a result further harm on the environment.
By the way, we often hear about people being harmed long term by trauma. Would it be a mistake to say that this is too a form of trauma?
Oh, absolutely. It's a form of trauma. In fact, the United Nations has called 15 days or more in solitary confinement torture for many people, especially people with mental health issues. So I think most people today agree that particularly long-term solitary confinement is torture.
One other overlap between incarceration and health issue you have concerns about is what goes on with medical transfers, and this is when I guess a person has a serious medical problem, they need to go from a prison setting to somewhere else. What are you trying to change with that?
So with that, up until the Criminal Justice Reform Act of last year, Massachusetts is one of only 5 states that did not have what we call a compassionate release program, where people who are terminally ill, literally dying and within 18 months of dying, or cognitively or permanently incapacitated, they can now petition for release from the correctional facility so that they would still be on parole, so to speak, but they would be in a more appropriate medical setting. That can be hospice care, and most people have been released until now into hospice care and have died at home. But people could also be released to nursing homes or other medical facilities in order to get that care. So it's costing the state a considerable amount of money to pay for care for these people. I had one particular client that within a 1-year period, it was over $1 million in surgeries, and he still ended up dying, but largely because the situation was so exacerbated within the prison. By the time he got to the hospital, he was already just extremely compromised, and he was due out on parole in a matter of months. And that ended up costing an incredible amount of money. So people with cancer, cancer patients who need a lot of care and expensive care, but even other people, like people who aren't, I had another client on a feeding tube who was mute and his limbs were completely retracted, was completely bedridden, 24-hour care, also incredibly expensive. And up until recently, Massachusetts did not have a way to really get these people out of the system where they could be on Medicaid and have those and have off the state.
We should mention, I know you work on a lot of policy and legislative issues, but we should mention you also help people in more direct ways. So if people want some more information or help, is there some way they can get in contact?
Absolutely. So families can contact us at our main number, which is 617-482-2773. State prisoners can call us on speed dial, and they just dial 9004. And from the county facilities, it would be 617-482-4124, and that's all collect. We accept all the calls collect on our end. We also have a website, which is www.plsma.org, and there's lots of information there as well. But we do provide direct services to prisoners. We also do file lawsuits and do a fair amount of policy work.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Elizabeth Matos from Prisoners Legal Services.